Hi, and welcome to the 62nd in our series on Middle Eastern Islamic history. And today's presentation is going to be rather different than what we typically do. This presentation and next week's presentation sort of go together. And this will be a 30-foot overview, although we definitely will get into the weeds in a certain way, of the development of political organization in the Middle East. So we've looked at a number of different locations, and if you could summarize the previous 15 or so presentations, they've been, let me look at a country for about 15 to 20 years and let me walk through the different events that have happened in that country and what was the situation. This is going to be, how did Middle Easterners think about political organization and what was happening in different countries over different times? What are these different systems? How does it all fit together? And so it's going to be a little bit different and a little bit more jumping around, but at the same time, a little bit more thematic, which has been a comment that some of you have been making. So I hope it works in that way. Now, the rules for those of you who are unfamiliar: this is not an academic presentation. I am not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the topics that we're going to be discussing today, political science. That said, this is a secular presentation. I'm going to try and give this presentation from a non-biased perspective. That said, this is going to be a contentious topic, so let's be respectful. But regardless of that, I love interactivity. So questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. I usually say that these presentations will be a 101 and a 201. A 101 meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. And a 201 meaning that if you already know something about this period, I'm going to probably tell you things that you didn't know. I'm also going to have a 2-hour hard stop, meaning that if there's any slides in this presentation that I don't get to today, I'll just roll that into next week. But that doesn't mean that we won't have more time for questions and discussion. So it just means that no new material will be presented. When I put dates below a person, if it's a political figure who's held office, those dates are their years of service. And if it's a philosopher, usually those dates are their life, right? Obviously, a person who is an adult male will not have only lived 3 years. So use a little bit of common sense, and you should be able to figure out what those dates are. This, like the other 61 episodes in the Middle Eastern Islamic History series and all the other series that are done on our History Mostly Ancient Discussions group, are on the YouTube page. Please subscribe to our YouTube page. Everything is recorded, and that way you can see all of these different episodes and play back your favorites and see everything in context. A lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about today is stuff that we did mention before in more detail when we looked at more localized cases, and now we're sort of pulling back. And if you want to see the upcoming meetings, next week on Wednesday will be the second part of this story, which is going to be the religious theocracy side, right? We're talking about secular politics today. That will be on the meetup, as well as our future presentations in this series, as well as other series that we do. And we appreciate PayPal donations. Zoom, Meetup, and YouTube are premium subscriptions. And so while we do provide this for free, and we're excited to continue to provide it for free, if you feel so moved, we appreciate PayPal donations, and we appreciate buy a coffee in order to keep the lights on. All right. So one of the things that we have to understand when we're entering modernity is that the Islamic world was coming from a medieval system. And in the West, we understand modernity to have happened sometime around the 16th century, the Renaissance, the development of modern humanism. All of these trends, we see those as the beginning of modernity. But modernity didn't really hit the Middle East and North Africa until the 19th century. So we're coming into the beginning of the 19th century, and this is the system you have. You have two distinct individuals and heads of government. I'm going to just choose 1550 in the Ottoman Empire because it was much more substantiated there. But this system, in the generalities that I'm going to describe, could apply to any system in the medieval period. There's a question about my definition of modernity and whether it encompasses industrialization, railroad construction. There certainly is that as part of modernity, but we're going to go in depth about what modernity is in a bit. Suffice it to say, it's more about the organization of power structures than it is about any particular industrialization. All right. And so when we have this medieval society, we have two centers of power. We have a secular center of power, which is in a king or a sultan or a prince, emir, one of these kinds of people. Usually it's a hereditary system, but it could be a dictator of some sort. It could be an army general. There are a variety of ways that this secular system could be rooted. And on the flip side, you have a religious leader who is vested with authority. And so we can split the duties between those that the sultan would hold. And by sultan, I'm referring to any of these secular rulers, and the Shaykh al-Islam. And of course, by Shaykh al-Islam, I could mean any of these religious leaders. And so the first thing is that we have a division between the kinds of law over which they are the dominant magisteria, right? So the sultan is responsible for terrestrial law. We're talking about things like contracts, torts, taxes in most cases. And he's writing those legal codes without serious consultation with the Shaykh al-Islam. Conversely, the Shaykh al-Islam will deal with things like inheritance, which is the Islamic law of waqf, right? You have things that are related to marriage and divorce. Those are all Islamic law. And if we're talking about non-Muslims in the Islamic Empire, they have their own religious authorities that will govern on these issues, and so forth and so on. There are some areas of overlap, like criminal law, but by and large, these maintain two separate legal categories. And as I mentioned, the Sultan is responsible for the taxes. He's also responsible for the jizya, which is the poll tax that was applied to non-Muslim subjects, especially Jews and Christians. And on the flip side, the Shaykh al-Islam would be responsible for collecting zakat, or Muslim charitable contributions. When it came to warfare, the Sultan would be responsible for actually moving the military in a certain direction. He was effectively the commander-in-chief, and that was his prerogative to direct those armies. But the Sultan didn't have the moral clarity to declare the rightness of a conflict. And this is something that a number of politicians struggle with today, is granting legitimacy to their particular military expeditions. The Shaykh al-Islam was capable of giving that moral support. And in fact, you would have Sufis and Islamic clerics marching in tandem with soldiers, especially if we're talking about the Naqshbandi Sufi order, or we're talking about a number of other groups like the Bektashi. These would march along with the soldiers and provide the religious legitimation for the military struggle. And you also see a division in the educational system. The Sultan was responsible for cultivating the bureaucrats who would run within his state. And therefore, we're talking about the establishment of either schools, or on a more individual basis, a tutoring system within the bureaucracy. And conversely, the Shaykh al-Islam was responsible for creating an Islamic educational system, creating Islamic universities for the training of qadis, for example, Muslim judges. And you also realize that education for non-Muslims was typically handled by non-Muslim leaders in a similar vein. And so you have these sort of two poles of power, and we can understand this relationship in much the same way that we can understand the checks and balances system to a certain degree that exists in Western democracies right now. And so this creates a very interesting relationship where the Shaykh al-Islam, or the Islamic side of the medieval governance, was often seen as the voice of human rights or human protection, even if it wouldn't be qualified in those terms. And so you had a sultan who was autocratic, who had the ability to do whatever he wanted with people's lives. And that was somehow constrained by the morality that the Shaykh al-Islam would compel him to. And so you create this sort of dynamic where there's a sympathy that a lot of Muslims feel towards the clerical establishment, because the clerical establishment is at least fair, and consistently so. Whether it's fair on a person-by-person basis, and whether we would agree with the decisions that they make in a modern era is a very different question. But that consistency and that willingness, at least, to acknowledge popular arguments is something that really made the judiciary feel like a representative of the people. And a good way to understand this in a Western context is the perception of the US Supreme Court, especially if you look at like the Warren Court in the 1960s, right? There's this court that is defending human rights in a case where the government is trying to go beyond what other people think is acceptable. And of course, those who would disagree with the decisions of those judges would call that an activist court, right? But that sort of relationship is the relationship that we're seeing in the medieval world, and why there's a sympathy for the religious establishment that we're going to see through the modern era. One of the other things that is worth pointing out in the medieval era is that from 1517 until 1919, the Ottomans ruled over the two holy cities, Mecca and Medina. And they inherited this title of caliph when they ruled over that territory. Historically, the caliph could only be vested in the family of Muhammad, the Quraysh tribe. And obviously, the Turkish rulers of the Ottoman Empire were not Quraysh. And this provoked a huge question about whether or not they were legitimate. But it was agreed that as long as they maintained peace and order and control, then that was God giving the imprimatur of legitimacy to these non-Quraysh Turkish individuals. But with the failure of the Ottoman Empire to secure this in World War I, that rulership really becomes called into question in a very serious way. Another point that's worth making is that the Ottoman Empire as a medieval system, and again, we're going to talk about the difference between medieval and modern very soon, couldn't effectively rule territories far from the capital of Istanbul, and relied significantly on local power brokers. If you want to compare this to the feudal system of Europe, you have a king, and then you have below him his lords, and those lords have their own sets of lower persons to whom the serfs would be responsible. It's the same in the Middle East. You had beys, or princes, for want of a better translation, or lords, for want of a better translation. And these beys would be responsible for the different wilayat, or the different states. Sometimes you would have a governor of those states. In each case, they would have significant autonomy of their own. And so the Turkish rule, especially prior to the 20th century, was not seen as oppressive. I have a comment here that this is very similar to the Spanish system of administering the colonies in the New World, and I actually would agree with that. The one difference I would make is that in the Middle Eastern system, in many cases, the religious leaders were instantiated and had actual governmental roles, as opposed to being strictly people who were connected, let's say, to the popular condition and permitted to live in the territory. So what is modernity, right? That's sort of the question that we're sort of grappling with here. And at each level, we can see that within a medieval state, you have attenuated power structures. You have this set of hierarchies in which at each level, there's a significant degree of autonomy. Distances are large. Communication is difficult. And so you have a lot of local administrators being able to control a significant amount of what goes on in those areas. In a modern state, you can have centralized control. You have quick communications, quicker distances can be crossed, and so you have a unified source of power. This also means that you have a unified military and a unified police. That's not what you had in the medieval period. You had distinct regions with their own militaries that would all be called together, and which was why the religious legitimation to the Sultan was so important. You also had borders that were sort of hazy. Nobody really knew where the empire necessarily ended. There are some things like rivers where it was obvious, but you can almost imagine that the borders were on a dimmer switch, that there's areas that are clearly within the territory controlled by the Sultan and areas that are clearly not in the territory controlled by the Sultan. But between those could be dozens, if not hundreds of miles, where there's some power and perhaps some tribute is paid, but it's not formal governance. And you have all these intermediate steps. With a modern state, borders become clear, they become surveyed, the same way that we have in modern relations today. But probably most importantly for our analysis of politics is that religion has a definedly different role in the modern state. In the medieval state, it has a specific role of making legitimate the actions that we're going to see in the various states. In the modern state, religion operates almost entirely separately from the state. It becomes something that the state can control. It can open and close it at will. And it becomes something that whose direct authority is not needed for the running of the state. So we talked about the Ottoman Empire case. In the Persian Empire, you can see this same sort of split. You had secular authoritarian rulers, Nadir Shah, Karim Khan, the Qajar dynasty. All of these represent these sort of autocratic secular rulers. But in their administrations, they would have religious clerics. Muhammad Bakr Majlisi, for example, was a Shiite cleric who created an entire Shiite bureaucracy during the Safavid period. Similar bureaucracies existed during the reigns of Nadir Shah and Karim Khan. And you also had the Grand Ayatollahs who stayed out of direct politics. They didn't have an appointed role, but they would involve themselves in political matters. For example, Grand Ayatollah Muhammad Hassan Ashirazi was an individual who wrote a massive fatwa against the tobacco industry that had been given a royal concession in the 1890s. And his fatwa was so powerful that even people in the royal family abstained from using tobacco. So you can see that this power play actually exists between these two checks and balances between those autocrats and these religious leaders in the pre-modern period. Another point that's important to stress and sort of shows what I was talking about the decentralization of power, is that with the exception of Nadir Shah, who really did unify the country militarily, the system in Iran was that nomadic tribes that controlled different regions would each have their own armies and would be responsive to the Shah, the king, if he called them, but only if they wanted to fight. So you have a weird situation. For example, if we remember our discussions about Iran in the early 19th century when they fought the Russian Empire, only the tribes in the northwestern region of Iran, in the area around Tabriz, were the ones that fielded their own militias. The rest of Iran didn't fight in this war. And it's one of the major reasons that despite having a significantly larger army than anything that Russia could field in the Caucasus, Russia actually had more forces at battle because Iran wasn't fielding its entire military. It was fielding 2 militias as opposed to the entire, let's say, 15 or 16 different regional militias. There's a question, what about empires like Babylonia or Persia before the rise of Islam? Did this decentralization always exist within the Fertile Crescent? The Mesopotamian part of the Fertile Crescent is unique in that it is flat. So once you have effective long-distance transportation, such as existed by the time of Neo-Babylonia, 600 BCE or so, you have the ability to unite all of this territory under one centralized ruler. But that is exclusively for Babylonia. Once you get out of that Mesopotamian area and you start getting into, let's say, the mountains of northern Iraq, like where Assyria historically was, if you get into Iran over the Zagros Mountains, and you're going to have a much more difficult time centralizing. And in fact, one of the things that we discussed in our episode on Reza Khan, I think that's episode 52 in the series, is that he had to fight wars against all of the different decentralized authorities, and most of them were in the mountains, like the Zagros or the Elburz. So absolutely, you had decentralized authority. And one of the issues before the Neo-Babylonian Empire, when communications were less effective, like, for example, the time of Sargon of Akkad, you had numerous city-states that were under autonomous rulership, and those city-states would have to pledge loyalty to Sargon, and he would demand tribute, and if he didn't receive tribute, he'd have to go to a number of different cities to assemble a coalition to go after that city. So generally speaking, before the modern era, it's very difficult to have a centralized state over any significant area. So we have 5 major ways that we see the modern world developing. But wait, you say, there's one method that's not on this list of liberals, ethnic nationalists, border nationalists, Arab socialists, and Islamists, and it's monarchies. Yeah, monarchies do exist, but the monarchies that exist are not themselves modern trajectories. These are simply the medieval systems that continued to exist into the modern era. So I'll take an example of Saudi Arabia, right? Saudi Arabia is a monarchical system. But one of the things that I want to point out with Saudi Arabia is that in Najd, which is the eastern part of Saudi Arabia, it's the bulk of its territory, but it's a smaller percentage of its population, except for the capital of Riyadh. The king of Saudi Arabia has to have a daily audience for locals to air their grievances. It's called the Majlis. And so the king or his representative will literally sit, and commoners will come up to him and tell him their grievances. Why does this continue? Well, it was tradition when Najd was a few thousand people for the tribal chiefs to receive all of these complaints and then to act upon them. And the Najdis made the argument, why is it the case that now we have all of this power? Why should we not continue to be able to avail ourselves of the royal prerogative? And so that continues. It's a medieval construct that continues into the present day, despite the fact that the population of Najd is now roughly 10 to 15 million people. Now, a point worth making is that unlike liberals, the Saudis make no argument that their government is legitimate based on voting or democratic norms or anything similar to that. Unlike nationalists, be they ethno-nationalists or border nationalists, the Saudis don't mention anything about their ethnicity being a constraining or expanding factor. They don't mention, for example, how they should conquer all the other Arabs because they are ethnically Arab, or conversely, that they shouldn't conquer anybody because all of the Saudi Arabian Arabs are the one true people, or that the borders mean anything. In fact, the borders of Saudi Arabia were imposed by the British, as we talked about in episode 51, where we talked about the formation of Saudi Arabia. And they don't make a claim, like the Arab socialists do, as we're going to see, that their legitimacy is based on a combination of nationalism and economic development. There is money that flows to the people, but that's not a legitimation of the state. And finally, the Saudis don't claim that their state is legitimate because of Islam or Wahhabism or anything else. Sure, Wahhabism is part of the state, and in fact, that forms that second pillar in the medieval system. But they don't make the argument that the state is a Wahhabi state, or that the Sultan is an irrelevancy that should be, and that the Wahhabi cleric should rule. That's simply not the argument that they make. This is simply the medieval system in the present. And we see the same thing with Kuwait. In fact, if we remember from that same episode, the Kuwaitis actually tried to conquer the area that is now Saudi Arabia before Saudi Arabia existed. There was a war with the Rashidi clan, which controlled that territory before Ibn Saud took it in 1902. Now, the Kuwaiti-Rashidi War was a devastating defeat for Kuwait, but that's what compelled its borders to be what it was in the south. And in fact, if you look at that map from 1803, you can see Kuwait's theoretical extent further south is much more than the modern state of Kuwait, because the Kuwaitis had no real sense of borders. It was whatever the emir managed to control, which is a completely medieval way of looking at geography, as opposed to the modern way with fixed borders. Remember that dimmer switch versus these exact points. And the Kuwaitis, on the same token, didn't make any argument about liberal democracy, about borders or ethnicity, or about social action, or about Islamic clerics. So you end up having those borders being fixed by the British. And in fact, the British fixed these borders because of the strong relationship between Mubarak al-Sabah and what becomes the British Protectorate of Kuwait. There is a question: does the Saudi crown family make any claim as to the term of divine right to rule? That's actually really interesting. The Saudi family, and we discussed this in the formation, has no legitimacy from a birthright perspective. There is nothing special about the Saudi clan from an Islamic historical perspective. And so legitimacy was incredibly difficult for them. In fact, that is the reason why they created the Charter of Dar'iyah, which fused the Saudi monarchy with the Wahhabi clerics, led at that time by Abdul Wahhab. And by doing this, those religious leaders granted legitimacy to the Saud family in much the same way that the religious leaders granted legitimacy in the medieval period, because Saudi Arabia is a medieval state. It's not a modern state. Same with Kuwait, and same with most of the monarchies in the Middle East and North Africa. There are only two exceptions: the monarchy of Jordan and the monarchy of Morocco. Those are the only two modern monarchies. All these others are medieval monarchies using medieval styles of legitimacy in a modern era. So, okay, so you say, well, I've addressed the monarchies now, but what about the communists? Well, let's talk a little bit about the communists and why the communists generally don't have a long trajectory in the Middle East. We actually have a number of different cases of communists, and we've seen them before. Just to sort of go through them, we talked about the Iraqi Communist Party, which coming into 1948 was actually very, very powerful. They stood a good chance of taking over the country. And you can see that by their organization of the Al-Wafba uprising in January of 1948. You also, if we remember from our Reza Khan episode, he had to put down a number of revolts, and some of those revolts, especially those physically closer to the Caucasus mountain range, because of proximity to the Soviet Union, were connected in some way to communism. Kuchak Khan and the Jangali called themselves communists. We talked about 2 weeks ago, Najati Sadqi, who was a Palestinian who fought on the Republican side of the Spanish Civil War and had learned communism and considered himself a communist, living in what is today Uzbekistan. And then, of course, we talked about the situation in the Southern Caucasus republics themselves. You had Stepan Shahumian, who was an Armenian who formed the Baku Commune in what is today Azerbaijan, and you have the Mensheviks, who formed the Georgian Republic in May of 1919. So it's not as if communists had no presence in the Middle East at all. They had some, and in Iraq, they had the best chance of ever seizing control relative to any area that wasn't directly impacted by the Soviet Union. So why did communism never really take off? There are a few reasons. The first reason, and it seems kind of counterintuitive to say this, communism was a universal system. It applied to everyone. It supported revolutions everywhere. And in many ways, the Middle East's fractious divides were not echoed by the communist rhetoric that came out. So what ended up happening is that the communists became delegitimized for being too universalist in their principles. Perfect example, if we go back to Iraq, the Al-Wathba uprising took place about 5 months before Israel declared itself as an independent state. Now, and we're going to touch on this, Israel in 1948 was in the Soviet sphere. The Soviet Union considered Israel a state that was likely to become a socialist or communist state. And so the instructions from Moscow to the Iraqi Communist Party were to support the validity of the state of Israel. That cost them pretty much their entire legitimation in the Iraqi context, because the antipathy towards Israel and its appropriation of what was seen in Iraq as Palestinian land and history meant that the communists weren't representing an Iraqi vision for the future. And so they lost power. Similarly, Stepan Shahumyan, when he tried to form the Baku Commune, he wasn't able to get significant support from Muslims, who we would call today Azerbaijanis, who were living in the region. And instead, in order to defend the commune, he had to rely on his ethnic Armenian heritage. And so the Dashnatsutyun, which was an Armenian paramilitary and terrorist organization, became the primary defensive force of the Baku Commune, turning what was in theory a universalist style of governance into what looked, at least to the Azerbaijanis, as an Armenian ethnic state. So the universality actually condemned the project because it simply couldn't bridge those ethnic divides. Another issue is that communism is dogmatically anti-religion. And you're coming to a society where, as we talked about in the medieval period, religion was the primary defender of the rights of the poor, destitute, uneducated. So the attempt to remove religion completely, as communists required, was something deeply antithetical to many people in the Middle East. And the final nail in the coffin was that Soviets were willing to support Middle Eastern countries and states, bring them into their sphere of influence, without them being out and out communist. They could be socialist, they could be Arab socialist, which is, we're going to talk about, not exactly socialist. Anything that put them at odds with the Western dominated system put them within the realm of Soviet support. And so if they didn't have to embrace communism to get Soviet support, they didn't feel that they needed to make that much of a leap. So now let's move into the actual 5 trajectories that make a difference in the Middle East. And the Islamists, of course, we're going to cover next week. So we're going to talk about the first 4 today. One of the things that we notice immediately about these 5 ways forward is that all of them move past the medieval system, in that they say, in the medieval system, you had the Sultan and the Sheikh al-Islam. You had the secular and the religious authority. You have a centralized state in the modern period. You don't need both. Choose one. The secular ruler can legitimate himself through the use of military force, through the use of the ballot box, through the use of social programs. He doesn't need a religious leader to legitimize him. The other perspective was, the religious leader is the center of morality. He doesn't need the Sultan to be the political imprimatur. He can just do the political action himself. That's the view of the Islamists. The other 4 here take that first view, that the Sultan should rule without the religious authority. Doesn't mean the religion is necessarily removed from society, right? It's not communism that is anti-religion. It's just secular. Religion operates separately from the state. So the liberal thought in the Middle East will talk about Westernization, industrialization, democracy, human rights, and minority inclusion. And we don't talk about this a lot in the Middle East, but that's not to say that it doesn't have a long and storied tradition there. And so we're going to go in and discuss what those mean. But first, we have to realize why liberalism is so difficult to find in the Middle East. The first thing is that, in contrast to the other 4 of those ways forward, democracy, rule of law, these values can result in negative outcomes for the people who are advocating them. If you're an ethno-nationalist representing, let's say, the Turkish ethnicity, And we're going to talk about that in a bit. And you're advocating a Turkish state to defend the Turkish ethnicity, that's going to protect you. If you're a border nationalist and you choose the borders of the state that you sit yourself in, you will be protected by that system. If you're an Arab socialist and you're ethnically Arab, that system is going to protect you. If you're an Islamist and you're a pious Muslim, that system is going to protect you. If you are a liberal and you believe in the rule of law, that system will not protect you if you are accused of corruption, if you're accused of any number of crimes, if you lose the election. And so it takes a certain kind of person to support a system that is going to put them in a worse position, possibly, for having supported it. And in addition to that, you don't have a clear constituency that would support liberal democracy, even if they themselves don't have to be the activists for it. A perfect example here is Ayman al-Zawahiri. So the natural inclination would be to say that liberal democracies would gain a significant amount of support from the educated upper classes and upper middle classes, because those people, and the middle class if they're educated, because those people have the most to gain from a liberalized system. But actually, if you look at Ayman al-Zawahiri and almost every major leader of any Middle Eastern terrorist organization, Ayman al-Zawahiri was the leader of Al-Qaeda for several years after bin Laden was killed. They all have advanced degrees. They're MDs, engineers, PhDs, you name it. Educated people don't necessarily choose liberalism. And so there's no clear constituency. The ethno-nationalist knows his clear constituency is the people of his ethnicity. The border nationalist knows that his clear constituency is the people within his territory. The Arab socialist knows that his clear constituency is the Arab people. And the Islamist knows that his clear constituency are Muslims of whatever subgroup he identifies with. Liberals don't have that. And so it's hard for them to organize. And in fact, this was one of the big issues that Egypt had when it had elections in 2012. The liberals simply did not have enough grassroots effort to be able to create a constituency that would vote in significant numbers for their candidates. The next thing is, and those of us who've lived in Western democracies see this quite often, people don't necessarily vote for the right things consistently. People vote against liberalizing norms. And if you give people the vote, they may well vote against the very human rights that you're trying to create through this system. And so it doesn't progress very far if people are voting literal autocrats into power. We've seen that in several Western countries as well. And the final issue that liberals had to deal with, especially after World War I, was that the system that they were supporting was a system that was used by the very countries that abused them. It was an imperialist system. That doesn't mean that it was part of the way that they were governed as part of the empire. The system that existed in the UK was very different than the system that the UK imposed on Egypt when it occupied it. But that connection between the imperialist powers that were liberal democracies and resorting to their mode of behavior was seen as deeply offensive for many people. There's a question of who had the most liberal leaning historically, Jordan, Lebanon, just structure of government. I wouldn't say that Jordan or Lebanon is that liberal. I think that a lot of people are confusing liberal in the sense of toleration, which exists in Jordan and Lebanon, as liberal in human rights, values, and constructs. I would say that Egypt has the longest history of liberalism, but it's not a liberal government now. And it has remained primarily an ideology rather than an implemented governance structure for exactly these reasons. Morocco might be a good choice. All right. So We enter the middle of the 19th century, and we have huge discussions about what it means to be an Arab as the Ottoman Empire is increasingly modernizing, as European literature is beginning to come into the Middle East, especially through Christians who are translating documents from Western sources. Christians in the Middle East, by the way, like Lebanese, for example. And you have the Islamic modernist movement as well. There's a question, is Egypt a junta-led state? Yes, at this point, Egypt is a junta-led state. But you have this situation, this renaissance that is occurring, this nahda. And we begin to see two groups that sort of separate out. The first group, and we're going to cover them a little bit later, are the nationalists. They believe in the ethnic ties that hold nations together. A different group are the Muslim modernists, led by Jamal ad-Din Afghani, who you can see in the upper right-hand side. Jamal ad-Din Afghani argues that what the Europeans have in terms of their democratic and liberal institutions is actually Islamic. He argues that Muslims have forgotten the true values that stem from the Quran, and so they are putting themselves in a bad position. In fact, his famous line is, I went to Europe and I found Islam, but no Muslims. And I went to the Arab world and I found Muslims, but no Islam. Meaning that the modern, effusive, scientific, progressive society of Europe was what Islamic society should become. That's the direction it should go. And he was not alone in thinking this, although he was the first. He influenced a number of other people. Muhammad Abduh was Egypt's answer to Iran's Jamal ad-Din Afghani. Namik Kemal was the Ottoman Empire's answer in what's today Turkey. And Rafa'at Tahtawi was an individual who was responsible for creating the first large-scale press in the Arab world, creating a newspaper. And his view was that a religiously centered morality would be the best guarantor, right? Drawing on that medieval heritage, the religiously centered morality would be the best guarantor of actual freedoms, freedom of conscience, freedom of behavior, freedom of speech, freedom in politics. While he believed in scientific progress, he didn't believe in that kind of secular government that would be separate from religion. In fact, the religious moral core would secure the beneficence of the human rights he was espousing. We see the same view among young Ottomans. This is a movement that was gaining power in Istanbul and the surrounding area in the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century. In particular, Namik Kemal and Ibrahim Shinasi argued that Islamic principles could help leaders choose what is good and what is evil. They referred back to a number of Quranic prescriptions that you should enjoin good and forbid evil. And they thought that that would be a good moral center for the government. Remember, the Sultan was capricious. He could make any rule he wanted. By compelling Islam as part of the solution, in fact, you'll hear a number of Muslims say that. They tend to be in the Islamist camp. Islam is the solution. But the Muslim modernists were the first really to pioneer this sort of mentality, that Islam could provide a solution to the failure of secular governance to be free and open to everybody. And like Rafa'at Tahtawi in Egypt, they built large-scale presses. They were subject to heavy discrimination from Sultan Abdulaziz when he was in power. And so a number of them, including Namik Kemal, fled to the West, but they didn't stop printing. And that was the magic of the printing press, is that they could continue to influence the politics from outside of these much more dictatorial areas. That's ultimately what led to the creation of the first parliament of the Ottoman Empire in 1876. But it's not just Muslims who are coming at it from the perspective that liberal institutions and human rights should be defended from a religious perspective. Francis Marash was a Lebanese Christian He was Melkite, meaning that he's Catholic, but according to the Byzantine Rite. Now, his view, and he explains this in his book Ghabat al-Haq, or The Forest of Truth, is that there has been a prosecution against the forces of light and happiness by the forces of evil and darkness. And that in order to liberate the people, they need to be given their rights. They need to be given their protections, their liberty. And that modernity should be a light like the light of truth that comes into these societies. But again, he does so in the context of a religiously based system for guaranteeing these human rights. For him, he equates it to the love of Christ, because that's the metaphor that he connects most with. And you can see here in his quote, "It is by love that the whole world is maintained. By love of all things move. By love, each creature perpetuates itself separately. And by love, the whole preserves its parts," and so forth. That was his view, that an incorporation of Christianity or some religious precept into the government would be that animating force that would help protect the lights of truth and of rights from a more autocratic system. We now have to look at Islamic modernism and realize that it did not succeed. No regimes were ever changed to become Islamic modernist regimes. And why did it fail? It failed for several different reasons. The first was that as European imperialism intensified, Islamic modernists really had no effective retort to the growth of these territories. And in many cases, contact with the Europeans dispelled notions that they were, in fact, the bringers of human rights and dignity. In fact, in many cases, they were responsible for massacres, discrimination, and a number of other atrocities in the creation of their empires. And we've discussed those in the previous 10 episodes or so. Another major issue is that the Islamic world fragmented, because when Turkey became independent from the Ottoman Empire, if we remember from episode 47 and 48, we talked about the Turkish War of Independence, where Turkey not only fought the Greek army, the French army, and the Armenian army to secure the independence of Turkey, it also fought the Ottoman army to secure the independence of Turkey and conquered the Ottoman Empire, at least its remnant. As part of that act of conquest, Kemal Atatürk, who was an ardent secularist, removed the caliph from his seat of power. This was the person who, historically, was the leading spiritual authority in the Islamic world. He was put into exile and the position of caliph removed. And we have to understand how startling and confusing and difficult this was for many Muslims around the world, not just in the Arab world, throughout the world. Imagine if the Pope was arrested and the Vatican burned down. I think that's sort of the right mentality to understand how difficult this was for many Muslims. The center of the faith was simply removed. So there became a question of how do you move forward? And there were movements across the Islamic world, especially in India, actually, of creating a new caliph. In the Arab world, there was the view that only somebody with the ancestral credentials, with the spiritual credentials, could become the new caliph. Certainly not Indian Muslims, since they don't have the ancestry. And so the question of how to create a caliph and where to create a caliph divided many in the Arab world. The next major issue is that the Islamic modernists didn't seem to support the state of Ibn Saud, the Saudi Arabian state. But this was the one successful Middle Eastern project. And in fact, this state ended up taking control of the holy places of Mecca and Medina, which still holds today. So, were they to be the new caliphs? Well, they weren't even Sunni, they were Wahhabi, at least from the view of most Muslims of the day. So, they couldn't be, and Saudi Arabia has never made a pretense to try and establish a caliphate. So this spiritual turmoil meant that something was missing from the core of Islam, and the modernists didn't quite have a solution that people saw as tenable. And so it split. Those who saw the human rights as the worthy part to preserve became secular and moved the religion off to the side. Those who believed the religion to be paramount and the human rights to be secondary became Islamists, and we'll talk about them next week. So there's a question here about how those secularists examine their situation. Ali Abdurrazak went through and wrote, "There's no real ijma' on the necessity of the caliphate, and experience shows that the caliphate was a series of disasters for the Muslim community." This view went to him as an Islamic scholar, arguing that the caliphate was no longer necessary, that people should govern themselves according to human rights norms, and abandon Islam as a necessity within government. For his perspective, he was actually removed from the church. Now, there's a point that somebody's saying that I'm arguing that the secularists are in favor of human rights. I'm arguing that these secularists are in favor of human rights, because these are ones who are following on the Islamic modernist tradition. We're going to see other secularists who absolutely are not for human rights. Taha Hussein, also an Egyptian, like Ali Abdurrazak, spent significant time in Europe. He actually married a French woman. And for him, he had said, in order to become equal partners in civilization with the Europeans, we must literally and forthrightly do everything they do, which is a very, very hard phrase to say in Egypt. Taha Hussein, in particular, is famous for the book that you actually see there, Fi Ash'ara Jahili, on the ignorant Arab poetry, referring to the poetry before Islam, but written in Arabic. And he argued that significant numbers of those works were either confabulated or forged in later periods from a scholarly point of view. He had to defend his thesis from inquisitors who argued that he was reproaching Islam and arguing against the tenets of the religion. But the judge actually found that he was a scholar making a scholarly inquiry. We also talked about it in Algeria. When the Algerians were moving through the same period, you had a group called the Young Algerians who wanted to integrate with France. They argued that what should happen is the dismantling of the indigenous system, that Algerian Muslims should be able to go to French schools. They should be part of the French constitutional system and have the same freedom and justice that the French citizens in the French Republic had. They were led actually by Amir Khalid, and Amir Khalid was particularly famous because his grandfather, Abd al-Qadir al-Jazairi, was one of the leaders of the Algerian resistance to the French during the pacification period. But the French didn't want any integration system. Amir Khalid was put into exile, and his movement, led subsequently by Ferhat Abbas, never managed to really gain any strong foothold in Algeria. One of the unique situations where liberalism survived in a certain degree was Tunisia. And this survived because the Tunisians were already integrated into the French system when the French were in control. That is to say, the resident general in Tunis created the Conférence Consultative Tunisienne, or the Tunisian Consultative Conference, which had a number of French settlers, but also Tunisians who were able to share their thoughts on the progress of the country while it was under the French protectorate, like Abdel Jalil Zaouch. And the Tunisian liberal elite was actually able to organize boycotts, like the Tunisian tram boycott, for which many of them were expelled from the country. But they came back after World War I, and they had a delegation to Nasser Bey. At that time, they organized themselves under the party called Dustur, a successor of which, Neo Dustur, was the party that continued to rule Tunisia until the Arab Spring. The Dustur party named itself that because of its adherence to a Dustur, a constitution. They wanted to take on French liberal policies and integrate them into a future Tunisian state. Now, of course, they wanted that state to still be ruled by the Tunisian Bey. Circumstances in terms of power sharing ultimately meant that that didn't end up being the case. But their view was that Tunisia should be a place with ample civil society. And in fact, we see that today. Of the Middle Eastern countries, Tunisia probably has the most expansive civil society of any Middle Eastern or North African country other than Israel or Turkey. So that is the liberals. We then move into the ethnic nationalists. Now, to my point earlier, the ethnic nationalists, border nationalists, and Arab socialists are all secularists. The secularists we were talking about were liberal secularists. These are not them. So what's exactly the difference between an ethnic nationalist and a border nationalist? An ethnic nationalist unites people based on a common culture, history, tradition, a common ethnicity. A border nationalist says that all people within the certain borders of the country are one nation. Now, often people will call border nationalism civic nationalism. And in the case of a country like the United States or Canada or Argentina or Brazil, I'd be inclined to agree. Those are states where civic participation is the mark of acceding to the national identity. But these are not countries in which you have mass civic participation. So I prefer to use the term border because that is what they do have. They have borders. So let's look at ethnic nationalism. So the first one that we're going to look at, and we can sort of see it in real depth, is Turkish ethno-nationalism. And it came in a variety of flavors. In the beginning, you had Turkification, which was the process by which people became Turkish. There are a variety of situations where this happened. Some of it was simply conversion to Islam and then speaking the Turkish language. That happened in a lot of Anatolia. In some cases, it resulted from the Muhajir, or the people who fled from the Balkans through the processes of integration with the Ottoman Empire and later the Turkish state, the Republic of Turkey that came after them. They considered themselves Turks. They acceded to that identity. Another flavor of Turkish ethno-nationalism was Turanism, which was an expansionary version of this, where Turks argued that all people who were ethnically Turkic, they spoke a Turkic language, should be part of one state, the Great Turan Nation. And you can see that nation spreading into the center of Asia, uniting a number of Turkic-speaking and even non-Turkic-speaking but nomadic peoples. And Turkification wasn't limited strictly to these two avenues. Another avenue was trying to convince other Muslims outside of Anatolia and the area around what's today Turkey into becoming ethnic Turks through language and religion. For the Arabs, they already had the Islamic religion by and large, but they didn't speak the Turkish language. And so in the 1910s, the Ottoman administration built what were called the Rushdiye schools. This is actually a Rushdiye school that survived World War I. It was taken by Jordanian authorities, and that's when you have this picture. But the schools were designed to teach Arabs to speak Turkish, force them to speak Turkish. This was one of the things that resulted in ethnic nationalism developing in the Middle East. This direct confrontation with Turkish culture and realizing that it wasn't theirs. And Turkish nationalism resulted in a variety of changes when Ataturk took power. We have a number of sacred cows that are slaughtered, for want of a better term, when Ataturk comes to power. The one that I show here is the presence of sculpture. Sculpture was strongly forbidden in the Ottoman Empire because of its relationship to idol making. And yet Ataturk opened up a new museum of the arts and encouraged arts. He also gave equal rights to women, including the right to vote. He made a number of different changes. Many of these were positive. But when it came to the concept of ethnic nationalism, many of these were slightly less positive. You can see, for example, the repression of individuals who refused to accede to a Turkish identity. Many of the Christians were expelled. That's the population exchange of 1923. You also have the Kurds, who were attacked in the Sheikh Said rebellion. You can see the Turks angling around the area of what is Turkish Kurdish majority regions. But on the flip side, ethno-nationalism also bound Turks together. You can see that Defensive Rights Society from Vilayet-i Sharqiya. The Defensive Rights Societies were the first parts of the Turkish National Army in the Turkish War of Independence. And so that nationalism brought them together. Ataturk also was able to use that consolidation of power to create a modern industrial state. You can see there that he has a number of policies with regards to the economic growth of the country. And you can also see that Ataturk had a set of borders that he envisioned for his independent Turkish Republic, which included territories that never became part of Turkey. But these territories, at least in theory, were conceded by treaty. And these borders were based on ethnic presence. These were areas where Turks had historically lived, or areas where people who were claimed to be Turks, like the Kurds, historically lived. As the wheel of time moves on, one of the interesting things is that nationalism ended up turning on its own. And so you had, during the reign of President İsmet İnönü, the racism and Turanism trials. These were individuals who were extremely right-wing in their approach, in their ethno-national approach, believing that the Turkish Republic should elevate the status of Turks above other populations that continued to live in Turkey. Nihal Atsiz is one of these people. He argued that it was perfectly permissible to be a discriminatory person within the Republic of Turkey, because the Turkish Republic itself was discriminatory. Kurds and Greeks, for example, could not hold certain ministerial positions. Turks were given an elevated status. He was just taking it further. The court wasn't convinced by his argument, but not because of the evidence, but because these trials were, in fact, a method for İsmet İnönü to get rid of right-wing rivals as the Soviets were making claims against Turkey. If these right-wing rivals were silenced, perhaps the Soviet Union would give up on these claims, which it did in the 1940s for a time, and would eventually do when Turkey became a member of NATO. We also have the Persians engaging in Persian nationalism under the reign of Reza Shah. And similarly to Ataturk, you had a lot of secularization. One of the particular favorite pieces, and this has become part of secularist revolt in Persian today, is what's called the Kashf-e-Hijab, or the removal of the chadur by force. Women across Iran were forced to deveil. And so the veil became a symbol of Islam as a communal faith, Islam as a historic faith, and the removal was seen as an embrace of secularism. Reza Shah also created an incredibly restrictive atmosphere. That atmosphere shows up in a number of Persian literary pieces from the period. There's Bulfikur, which is the main book, The Blind Owl, by Sadegh Hidayat. And in this book, he discusses life basically being a blind man who's in the throes of deeply disturbing depression and dementia. In fact, the book is believed to have caused many Persians to commit suicide because they read it and they connected so deeply to the troubled nature of that character. Earlier versions of the book, before the Islamic Revolution, were actually not allowed to be sold in Iran because of this. The result, of course, came from when people brought it in illegally because it connected so deeply with their condition of oppression. Reza Shah, like Ataturk, we didn't mention it on the Ataturk side, but they tried to venerate pre-Islamic civilization in their region. Reza Shah built, for example, the tomb of Ferdowsi. Ferdowsi was a poet who stressed the pre-Islamic culture of Iran, even though he lived in the period in which Iran was majority Muslim, and he was a Muslim too. In the case of Turkey, they venerated the Hittites. And in fact, at Anıt Kabir, the burial place of Ataturk, you can see 26 lions, which represent the Hittite lions. We also have a sort of ethno-nationalism developing in Morocco in resistance to Spanish colonialism, where Abdelkrim was able to unite different Amazigh. Amazigh are unfortunately often called Berbers, but that's not the name that they choose. And these Amazigh had different laws and different clans, organizations, but Abdelkrim united them through their common struggle against the Spanish. And in fact, they were able to prevail against the Spanish and create their own republic for 6 years. The republic was eventually overthrown, not because of efforts by the Spanish, but by the fact that this republic tried to extend into the French-controlled areas of Morocco. And then French and Spanish cooperation was able to finally defeat the Berbers, the Amazigh. But in this state, you could begin to see a unified Berber sensibility. Another group of ethno-nationalists are the Syrian nationalists. They didn't see Arabs as a consistent, uniform identity. They saw the people of the Levant, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, those indigenous Arab populations, as being of their own unique culture. They referred to this area as Balad al-Sham, or Greater Syria. One of the things that may surprise people is that the foremost luminaries in this discussion were almost always Christians. Boutros al-Bustani was Lutheran. Anton Saadeh was Greek Orthodox. Both were Lebanese, and both saw the future of the Levant as being one in which the Levant would stand together as one ethnic civilization. These particular writers talked about how the Levant was a mixing of various cultures and religions and situations that was very different than what existed elsewhere in the Arab world. The large number of Christians in Mount Lebanon, the historic populations of Jews in Israel/Palestine, the Alawites along the Syrian coast, the Druze in the mountains between what is today Israel and Syria. All of these populations didn't exist anywhere else, and they fed into this very unique cosmopolitan fabric. That was what really defined the population of Bilad al-Sham. Anton Saadeh was actually quite famous for arguing that the official language of such a unified state should be based on the Syrian dialect of Arabic. It shouldn't be based on Fusha, or traditional Arabic, because it should reflect the culture of the Levant region, not the historic nature of the Middle East. Many believers in Syrian nationalism fought in the Franco-Syrian War of 1920, which would have tried to establish a Syrian monarchy under King Faisal, but the French overthrew this and established the protectorates in Syria and Lebanon. And Faisal became king of Iraq. There's a question of how far can they trace back the Syrian culture. That this is what made the country so volatile, was the forced construct. When they're talking about Syrian culture, they're not talking about the borders of Syria today. They're talking about the Levant region. And so when they talk about it, they're talking about the shared experience of the Crusades. They're talking about the shared experience under the Ottoman Empire. They're talking about the shared experience of various Egyptian revolts that conquered areas in the Levant. They're talking about the clan warfare that occurred in areas of Lebanon where different religious cliques came together. And so they actually build a pretty extensive historical period. They focus a significant portion of that period after the Islamic conquest because they see Islam as part of the unifying fabric. But the difficulty in bringing Syria together today is not because of the issues of the Syrian nationalists. It's the issues of the various political factions that are represented by different ethnic groups in Syria having very different situations. And those situations are playing out in terms of power struggles. So that's the issue, not a national identity issue. In Lebanon, however, there was very much an identity issue. I want to point to the map where you can see that dotted black line. The areas inside that dotted black line were Mount Lebanon, and you can see by the large percentage of red that those are areas that are majority Christian. Red represents Maronite. Other Christians are represented by some of the other colors, like orange or yellow. And you can see, therefore, that within Mount Lebanon, the population of Christians is over 70%. The problem, however, is that there's very little farmland in this area. And during World War I, a number of Maronites on the mountain died. About 50% of the Maronite population died in what's called the Great Famine of Mount Lebanon. And so the Lebanese convinced the French to expand their territory, what's called Greater Lebanon, which is the territory that Lebanon now controls. And if you look in those areas, you see that those populations are overwhelmingly Shia in purple or Sunni in green, which meant that you would have a Lebanese population that wouldn't be dominantly Christian. And so Christian symbolism couldn't be the exclusive symbol of the country. And yet, you had to create a system that would permit all of the population to come together and not just repress the Christian population. And so what you end up having is Lebanese thinkers, especially from the Maronite community, like Said Akel, talking about Phoenicianism, saying that the Lebanese are the descendants of the Phoenician civilization. And that's an identity that both Muslims and Christians can share. Christians perhaps more so, because of Muslims having Arab admixture, at least in his view. And so in this way, the Christians could be the legal inheritors of a greater Lebanon, despite them being of a different religious faith than the Muslims whose territory they were sharing. They were more Phoenician than the Lebanese, than the Muslim Lebanese, but since the Muslim Lebanese were still Phoenicians themselves, they could be part of the system. Eventually, you had a number of fights between the different parties. The Syrian Social Nationalist Party, which represented Syrian nationalism, conflicted with the Kata'ib, which represented Maronite nationalism. And what ended up was the National Pact of 1943, which sort of bound all these different ethno-nationalisms together in one government. Understandably, this government has been relatively unstable. And it's been unstable because if there was ever an opportunity for one of these different groups, be it the Maronites, the Sunnis, the Shiites, the Greek Orthodox, the Druze, whichever group, to establish more power, they attempted to do so. And so conflict broke out in Lebanon in 1958. We're going to discuss that. And it also broke out in Lebanon in 1975, which is the much more famous civil war. We also have nationalism, ethnic nationalism, breaking apart attempts at federation. If we remember the Transcaucasian Democratic Federative Republic, which was declared in February of 1918 and began to go to war with itself in May of 1918, it tried to include all of the Georgian, Armenian, and Azerbaijani people into one country. And in fact, the representatives were split into rough quarters of Georgian Mensheviks, Dashnaks, representing the Armenians, the Musavat, representing the Azerbaijanis, and 36% of the other assorted nationalities that exist in the Caucasus region. As soon as this unity was created, it fell apart, and you had interethnic strife and fighting, resulting in those three becoming independent Caucasian republics before being Sovietized in 1921. Another ethnic nationalism that actually came to the Middle East from the outside was Zionism. You had Theodor Herzl, an Austrian Jew, who attended the court-martial of Alfred Dreyfus, and in that moment, in the center of what he believed to be civilization, seeing such an anti-Semitic act of impugning a Jew strictly for his Judaism, of betraying French secrets when evidence located the actual spy, he realized that Jews had no place in Europe. They needed to go to a homeland of their own. And he wrote 2 books about it, Der Judenstaat, or the Jewish state, where he discusses the nature of such a country, and Alt Neuland, where he discusses the restoration of the historic Jewish territory in the land of Israel. Once Jews get to Israel, you also have 2 different kinds of ethno-nationalism that begin to develop. You have labor Zionism, which is a left-wing version and is dominant until about the 1970s. And you have revisionist Zionism, which is much more aggressive. And that really begins to dominate after the 1970s. But both found their seeds in the mandatory period. Zionism, of course, had a difficult road to hoe with the remaining indigenous population, the Arab population, who many considered could not be a part of the Jewish national project. Some considered that they would create a binational state. In fact, Vladimir Jabotinsky, in the very beginning of his life, wrote about the possibility of binationalism. But as time moved on, Palestinians become outside of the Jewish view and either are a different class of citizen or are simply outside of the governing process. You also have the creation of Arab religious ethno-nationalism and supremacism. Probably the most famous view, which is Arab exceptionalism, is put forward by Abdurrahman al-Kawakibi. He wrote the book al-Qura, which argued that Mecca and Medina were the center of the world because it was there that the most revelatory experience in human history happened. And the Arabs were responsible for that human history. Arabs were part of that moment. It was incumbent on Arabs, therefore, to be the rulers. It would be they who would bring society forward into a new and enlightened age. And he contrasted this with the Ottoman Turkish government under which he lived by writing The Nature of Despotism and the Sources of Enslavement, Tabai al-Istibdad wa Masara al-Isbad. And some of those Arab nationalists began to see more bonds outside of their particular territories, resulting in solidarity, for example, with the Palestinian cause, despite not being Levantine. Connections with Muslims in places like China, transcending the cultural border to a religious border, trying to create the Arab League, like we see with the Alexandria Protocol. All of these ways to push Arabs beyond simply a local ethnic group. Of course, we can't talk about ethno-nationalism without talking about Kurdish ethno-nationalism. Now, Kurds entered the 20th century as a number of feudal territories. Remember, they were in the Ottoman Empire. They were in a pre-modern state. And the Kurds were able to dominate a number of local principalities in that state. These principalities would pay tribute to the Ottomans or to the Persians, as you can see in the case of Ardalan, Jalali, and Shikak. But those areas were always governed at the whim of the sovereign. And throughout the 19th century, there had been attempts by Istanbul and by Tehran to consolidate and unify their territories. This resulted in a number of different rebellions. One of those rebellions was led in the north of Iraq, in the region of Baban, by Mahmoud Barzanji, who created a state there in around 1923. In fact, he worked in parallel with Shafik Özdemir, who was a Turkish general, in order to try and force the British out of the north of Iraq. It was ultimately not successful. Barzanji was expelled from the region when the British were able to retake it. At the same time, on the Iranian side of the border, Simko Shikak was raising a rebellion against Reza Khan. Now, there's debates as to whether these Kurdish leaders were advocating on behalf of Kurdish nationalism per se, or they were simply trying to expand their power in a pre-modern sense. They were trying to create a new, larger fiefdom and still pay tribute to the sovereigns under which they lived, or create an independent territory, but for their clan, not for Kurds as a general rule. Barzanji, there's considerable debate about which side he was fighting for. Simko Shikak, there's much less. You can see the letter that he wrote to Barzanji in 1923, arguing that Kurds, despite having different nominal sovereigns, should unite together and fight off all enemies of the Kurdish people. Shikak was removed from power by Reza Khan and Mahmoud Barzanji by the British. And of course, as we talked about earlier, the Sheikh Said revolt was put down by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. And so all three of the nascent Kurdish rebellions were put down, and organized states that were able to consolidate their power and hold over the territory were the replacement. That didn't stop the Kurds from trying to agitate for independence, but it would come in fits and starts from that point forward. So now we go to the border nationalists. Now, the border nationalists really care about what happened within the borders of the state, and that's how they're going to create identities. As opposed to ethno-nationalists, they don't feel the need to go after minorities and colonists, but they are deeply distrusting of regional alliances because they don't see any cooperation with those outside of their border, especially those who may embrace ideologies that would try to attract the ethnicities within their state. And they don't have a consistent economic policy either. That policy is entirely contingent on who the ruler of that country is. Probably the most famous of the border nationalists is the Egyptian movement called Pharaonism. We talked about, for example, Mustafa Kemal, who was one of the most ardent advocates for Pharaonism, building on the Egyptian past, arguing that Egypt has a distinct history from the rest of the Arab world. It connects back to the history of the pyramids. In fact, that connection to the history of ancient Egypt into modern Egypt is shown by this sculpture, Egypt Reawakened, which was a combination of the ancient Sphinx and a modern Egyptian woman taking off her hijab, in particular Hoda Sharawi, one of the leading Egyptian feminists, showing that there's a continuity of Egyptian civilization and that continuity connects to all the people of Egypt. It's not just the Muslims. The Jews of Egypt, like Murad Farag, wrote on his views supporting Pharaonism and considering himself a national of Egypt. He was also, by the way, a supporter of Zionism, but he argued that the Jews of Egypt don't need Zionism. He supported Zionism for the Jews of Europe because they desperately needed it. For him, he felt that his place was Egypt because Egypt could include its Jewish population in a way that Europe couldn't. You also see a number of Copts supporting Egyptian Pharaonism for exactly the same reason. In fact, the Copts themselves consider their liturgical language to be a direct descendant of the language of ancient Egypt. They are the living connection. And Pharaonists would point to that. In fact, Coptic was a language which is descended from the ancient language of the pharaohs, was still used by Copts, according to Makrizi, as late as the 16th century as a common language of daily speech. You can also see the political cartoons where Tutankhamun is actually telling Lord Carnarvon that he should leave Egypt immediately and only allow those of true Egyptian stock to rule over Egypt, not the British, who were occupying it at that moment. Saad Zaghloul and a number of other leaders from the Pharaonist movement formed the Wafd Party, and the Wafd Party led to a number of protests in Cairo after World War I. They were protesting the incredibly abrasive level of British occupation, and they were opposing a number of the restrictions on Egypt. In fact, you can even see, if you look close at the protest, that one of the flags that they're holding up is an Islamic crescent with 3 stars, and within that crescent is the cross and the Star of David, indicating the 3 religions that represent all of Egypt. And it wasn't just men who protested. In fact, the protest was at its greatest strength when women joined. Many of them still wore the veil, but they protested in the name of their country, in the name of Egypt. Another similar situation was the situation in Palestine itself. Palestinian nationalism has almost exclusively been a border nationalism that has been inclusive of both the Christian and Muslim populations. And this comes from the time of Daher al-Umar. As we discussed, he allowed Jews and Christians to come into the areas of Palestine that he controlled in the 18th century in order to improve the economy. And those people became part of the Palestinian population. They were considered no different than any of the other families. You start to see Palestinians referring to their area as Palestine as early as 1911, so before the British Mandate. I mean, Khalil Beidas writes the earliest discussion of Palestine in 1897, but the creation of a newspaper with wide-scale circulation really shows how the name had continued. And while there are a number of different Levantine Arabic dialects, within the territory of Palestine, they have become concentrated and consistent as time has gone on. In terms of leadership within the Palestinian world prior to the State of Israel being declared, the way the Palestinians got together was on the Arab Higher Committee. There were 2 general Muslim families from Jerusalem that had the most pull. Those were the Nashashibis and the Al-Hussainis. But other families were also represented, including Christian families. And another state that was defined on borders more than anything else was Jordan. In fact, Jordan's case is perhaps a reverse ethnic nationalism, where the rulers of the country are not indigenous and their military corps is also foreign. Said al-Mufti, for example, one of the leaders of the Jordanian military in its earliest days, was Circassian by ethnicity, which is an exiled minority from southern Russia. Now, the reason Jordan was able to develop in the way that it did was that Lord Curzon basically had no idea what to do with Jordan. And so he allowed Abdullah, son of the Sharif of Mecca, to go to the various towns and proclaim an emirate over all of them. And then he concentrated his power over all the people under his territory, those he believed could be part of Jordan, including those, of course, of other parts of the Levant. He considered under his purview the people of Palestine, which is why after reclaiming the territories of the West Bank by his army, he went to Jericho in the same way that he had been to the various cities of Jordan, like Amman, Salt, Irbid, and Ma'an, in order, Aqaba, to get the approval of the West Bank to be part of Jordan. He considered it within Jordan's boundaries, and so he saw no meaningful distinction between the, quote, ethnic Palestinian population and the, quote, Jordanian ethnic population. Syria, in its earliest days, was also border nationalist more than ethno-nationalist. Lebanon was different. But Syria, you ended up with a situation where the Druze Sultan al-Atrash, the Sunni Fawzi al-Qawwaqji, the Kurdish Ibrahim Hananu, the Shiite Ayash al-Hajj, all worked together with Abdurrahman Shah Bandar, another Sunni Arab, to revolt against the French. But when Damascus was shelled and the French government reorganized, that put an end to that revolt. We also have Iraqi nationalism under the Free Officers led by Abdul Karim Qasim, which was in power from 1958 to 1963. I would want to point you to the symbols of the Republic. You can notice that it doesn't look like any typical Arab flag you've ever seen, in that there's no predomination of red, while the colors red, white, green, and black, which are similar to other Arab colors, are on the flag. None of the Islamic symbols are there. In fact, the symbol in the center is a sun, Shamash, which was one of the gods worshipped by the ancient Mesopotamians. Abdul Karim Qasim used Mesopotamian symbols and ideas to represent how he was going to unify the various populations of Mesopotamia. He reached out to Christian minorities like the Assyrians. He reached out to Kurds as well. You can see Mustafa Barzani and Abdul Karim Qasim. Unfortunately, his relations with the Kurds, especially Barzani, soured midway into his administration. But his goal was to include all the peoples of Iraq, not just Arabs. In fact, his parentage was Sunni and Shiite as well. He came from a blended family, and so therefore could represent both Sunni and Shiite Arabs. One of the interesting things to point out here is that he pursued an incredibly socialist-leaning policy. He expropriated land, especially from the Iraqi Petroleum Company, which, despite its name, was not owned by any Iraqis. It was owned by Westerners and partially by the Turkish government and partially by a particular businessman who lived in the West. But he expropriated this land and redeveloped it for middle-class and habitation. One of those areas is an area called Medinat al-Thawra, which is now a suburb or district of Baghdad, and it's called Medinat al-Thawra, meaning Revolution City. This land expropriation improved the lives significantly of many Iraqis and was part of why he was seen as a socialist. He entertained the support of the Iraqi communists, which still existed, although in a weakened form, and used them to facilitate relations with the Soviet Union. It's believed that by a number of people that the coup that overthrew him in 1963 was orchestrated by the CIA, given his pro-socialist leanings. So we finally get to the last in this group, the Arab Socialists. And the Arab Socialists believe in a transnational Arab identity, meaning that unlike the Syrian nationalists who believed that Syrian Arabs were special, but they didn't connect to Arabs outside, or the Pharaonists who had a specific Egyptian culture, Arabs were the population throughout the Middle East who spoke Arabic. They could respect non-Muslim Arabs, but Islam was certainly important to them in a certain way, but they were very hostile to non-Arab minorities and colonists. And the socialist aspect resulted in, like Abdul Karim Qasim, them engaging in certain projects to try and redistribute wealth. So when we talk about Pan-Arabism, we're talking about all of this land being part of that Pan-Arab space that they're trying to unite. And the idea of Pan-Arabism is fundamentally that Arabs are one culturally united group of people. They're just split arbitrarily by a number of borders that are erected in their lands. And so if they were able to be together, it would be a natural fit. I want to spend a little bit of time going over the philosophy of Pan-Arabism and then the philosophy of socialism to put together Arab socialism. Saad al-Husri is probably the godfather of this entire ideology. And I want to take note of his quote. I'm going to read it and then do a little bit of analysis here. Every Arab-speaking people is an Arab people. Every individual belonging to one of these Arabic-speaking peoples is an Arab. And if he does not recognize this, and if he is not proud of his Arabism, then we must look for the reasons that have made him take this stand. It may be an expression of ignorance. In that case, we must teach him the truth. It may spring from an indifference or false consciousness. In that case, we must enlighten him and lead him to the correct path. It may result from extreme egoism. In that case, we must limit his egoism. But under no circumstances should we say, as long as he does not wish to be an Arab, and as long as he is disdainful of his Arabness, then he is not an Arab. He is an Arab regardless of his own wishes. Whether ignorant, indifferent, undutiful, or disloyal, he is an Arab, but an Arab without consciousness or feeling, and perhaps even without conscience. Now, this meant that various groups that had learned to speak Arabic as the dominant lingua franca, but didn't consider themselves Arabs. These were people like Maronites. And there were a number of Arabic-speaking Kurds. There were Assyrians and other Christian minorities who spoke Arabic. That these people, in his view, were Arabs, and they couldn't deny that to him. Even people who would say things like the Pharaonists, especially in the later periods, like Lutfi al-Said in Egypt, that would say, I'm Egyptian before I'm Arab or Muslim. Sultan al-Husri would argue, no, you're Arab regardless of your personal identification. And in many cases, Sultan al-Husri was part of the education ministries in the countries in which he lived, in Iraq, in Syria. And so he created educational materials that were designed to compel the idea that Arabic speakers were Arabs. He also held the idea that this idea of differentiated states not being the natural way of the Arab people. In responding to this, I'm constantly asked how it was that the Arabs lost the 1948 to 1940 war over Palestine when there were 7 states and Israel was only 1. My answer is unequivocal. The Arabs lost the war precisely because we were 7 states. Meaning that if the Arabs had been 1 state, they would have been able to defeat Israel. And in fact, that's probably true. As we talked about in episode 57, when we were talking about the independence war of the state of Israel, Israel was able to deal with each of the nations on its own terms, and Jordan's territorial ambitions with regards to Palestine put it at deep odds and suspicion by all of the other members of the alliance, and Jordan was the strongest single member. A little earlier in time was Georgi Zaidan. Georgi Zaidan was a Lebanese Greek Orthodox, so he was actually Christian. And he founded a newspaper, magazine called Al-Hilal. There's a question, wasn't Israel armed by Western powers? It was not armed by Western powers in the independence war. It was armed by Western powers in subsequent conflicts. In the independence war, it was armed primarily by the Soviets through Czechoslovakia. Now, Al-Hilal, as a magazine, put together a number of different posts chronologizing the history of the Arab people. And one of the things that's particularly interesting is that if you look at the stories that he decided to tell, and he told those stories with a particular emphasis on historical accuracy, those stories are almost all of the Muslim story of history. Things like the Fitna al-Kubra and the second Fitna, the first Islamic civil wars. They were about issues in the days of Muhammad Ali in Egypt, other sorts of issues that were Muslim on Muslim issues. For him, that was part of the Arab identity, that it had to do with Islamic civilization. And that connection between Arabic and Islam meant that he was a supporter of Islamic civilization by being a supporter of Arab civilization. And despite being a Christian, he saw no objection to being a committed Christian and supporting this kind of civilization. So the last beyond Pan-Arabism that I want to investigate is Zaki al-Arsuzi's. Now, al-Arsuzi is actually Alawite, right? That's another religion. That's a post-Islamic religion. And there are a few things that I want to point out here from his quote. Nationalism to Arabs is inveterate and as ancient as the earliest human history. Arabs had a myth reaching back to Adam and Eve. It is believed that Arabs were all of one kin. in that this was the basis of their superiority and their erected rank among nations. And as for the principles of Arab nationalism, it is based on fraternity and brotherhood by nature and the proximity of their descent. This kinship is not constricted to racial kinship only, but there is kinship in culture and superiority. Therefore, the Arab nation is not only an extension to one family, but also a human construction, as well as common interests and common solidarity. You can see that superiority show up twice. Zaki al-Arsuzi took cues from both French and German nationalism of the 1930s in constructing his Arab nationalism. And so by grafting the view from al-Kawakibi that there was a superiority vested in Arabs through the discovery of the Quran and its promulgation, and the Nazi view of racial supremacy, he managed to fuse that into a cultural hegemonic supremacy that would be part of the pan-Arab civilization. In particular, he was motivated to write politically because he grew up in Latakia, the city in that circle, which was very close to Alexandretta, which was acquired by Turkey under the name of Hatay province because of the French willingness to part with it in exchange for Turkish sympathies and not necessarily being pro-Nazi in 1936. This separation brought with him the sense of this racial camaraderie and kinship, this cultural camaraderie and kinship as well, that should be across all Arabs and connect Alawites like himself to the Sunni majority of Syria. And then we have the socialism part. And I'm going to Michel Aflaq. Aflaq is very famous as probably the founder of the Ba'ath movement. Him, along with Al-Arsuzi and Bitar, those three individuals founded the Ba'ath Party. And it's very important to see what he says about socialism, which is that it's something very different than what exists outside of the Middle East. For him, socialism is simply a way to get people involved in the political system, removing wealth from the most historically empowered nobles and leaders and distributing it among the poor so that way they have jobs and a way to move forward in their life. But it's not socialism in this larger sense as the communists would see as sort of a world-ending new form of government. In truth, this is simply a way to perpetuate a capitalist system in the long term. Now, that capitalist system should not be exploitative, and that's why we see the liberty we seek is not opposed to legislative measures to curb the exploitations of feudalist capitalists and opportunists. But he's perfectly open to a not entirely socialist view. Certainly nothing as close to as the socialism that we see in Iraq under Abdul Karim Qasim. And he's also Greek Orthodox. Now, we should also be clear that socialism wasn't only confined to the Arabs. As we talked with Dov Ben Barokhov, the Zionists also had a number of socialist institutions. You can see the Histadrut, which is the General Organization of Workers. It was founded a mandate of Palestine, but continued into the independent state of Israel. And I just wanted it there as a counterpoint. There's this discussion about how to categorize Arab socialism. Most people tend to see it as a left-wing movement because they support republics, secular power over religion, and revolutions towards new systems. And they support some degree of wealth distribution and industry nationalization. We're definitely going to see that. But they also have a number of right-wing characteristics. They feel that the government should crush protests in order to defend peace and stability, as opposed to allowing a true freedom of thought. They believe in a national group that should be prioritized over others, the Arabs, in terms of their ideology, economics, and image. And their foreign policy is expansionist. They want to create a unified pan-Arab state. And so military is a key institution of the government, which is very different from what we see on the left. So I find it difficult to classify Arab socialism as a left-wing ideology. So if we look at Egypt to sort of see the rise of Arab nationalism, because Arab nationalism really focuses to a strong degree on Gamal Abdel Nasser. You can see him in the car on the right-hand side. He came to power in the Free Officers' Coup in July of 1952, along with Mohammed Naguib, but he eventually managed to move aside from him. Now, we should be clear, Gamal Abdel Nasser was exceedingly powerful because he was exceedingly popular. You can see, for example, the crowds in Alexandria. He would routinely have large-scale crowds clamoring to see him. In fact, when he resigned after Egypt's failure in the Six-Day War, there were mass protests to unresign him, that they loved him so much that they couldn't accept that he would give up power, and so he came back into power. How did he cultivate this kind of love and admiration? There are several different ways. The first one was that he created the Sawt al-Arab, or the Voice of the Arabs, which was a radio communication. Now, this was the beginning, this was the 1960s. In much of the Arab world, people did not own televisions. They couldn't afford them, but they did have radios. And so Nasser's voice and the voice of his speechwriters, like Ahmed Said, were able to popularize him throughout Egypt. And he was very clever in that he created a method of speaking that was mixed between traditional Arabic and modern Cairene dialect. By doing this, he spoke enough Cairene dialect that Egyptians could understand him without problem. But he also spoke enough standard Arabic that non-Egyptians outside of Egypt could understand him as well, and allowed his radio communications to be spread far and wide. Throughout the Middle East, Nasserist parties began to develop throughout different countries. Another reason he was intensely popular, that he began to nationalize a lot of the foreign businesses that existed in Egypt. In particular, he nationalized the British-owned Suez Canal. And Egyptians saw, at least to the perception at the time, that for the first time somebody was actually going to be responsive to the issue of imperialism and British control of the country. Nasser was creating an Egypt for Egyptians. He also embarked on massive public works projects like the Aswan High Dam to generate electricity, to empower Egyptians, quite literally. He also connected with leaders throughout the Arab world, others who supported his mission of revolutionizing and moving towards a more egalitarian social structure in the Arab world. A perfect example is Ahmed Ben Bella, who was president of Algeria from independence in 1962 until he was overthrown in a coup in 1965. You can see also in that picture Arif, who was the president of Iraq in that same period. All of these were seen as being in league and growing together. And the fact that Nasser was willing to lead alongside other Arab leaders was well seen by Arabs outside of Egypt. And Nasser made sure to make friends outside of strictly the Arab community. He reached out to the non-aligned movement. In fact, along with Joseph Broz Tito of Yugoslavia and Jawaharlal Nehru of India, was one of the founders of the non-aligned movement, meaning that he could have relations with the Soviet East, and increasingly those became his dominant relations, as evidenced by Che Guevara visiting him in 1966. All right, so since I've got to the magical hour, we'll continue this discussion on Arab socialism next week. Now we're going to ask questions. I'm also going to go and read over some of the things in the chat that I felt weren't proper to respond to in the moment, but are really interesting and thought-provoking. So who are we? We are History, Mostly Ancient Discussions. I am doing my Middle Eastern history series, and that series will be on Wednesdays now at 7 p.m. And that's weekly. We also have an Asian philosophy series led by Jason Peng on Saturdays at 7. We occasionally do a European Union security once a month between me and Aaron. All kinds of other series, Powerful Women, Dead Languages, Greco-Roman Civilization. I encourage you to join the meetup group in order to find out all the fun things we're doing. And in fact, we have a number of short-run series like our Russo-Ukrainian War series, which will probably have an episode in March or April. And periodically, we have our Islam 101 series and Islamic City Tours with Dr. Sibyl Ahmed and Nur al-Sayed. And we even have a number of older series that you can see on our YouTube. So back to those questions. There's a question of, can one make the broader argument that border nationalism led to World War I? No, I would say that to the extent that nationalism led to World War I, it was ethno-nationalism, not border nationalism, because it was ethno-nationalism that was ripping countries apart based on the ethnic populations they're in. Border nationalism, I guess you could make an argument that France wanting Alsace-Lorraine back could be an instance of border nationalism, but generally speaking, it's less of a factor. There's a comment here. Apparently, you have to have had a PhD to work for bin Laden. It may PhD or MD. But yes, at the very high levels of Al-Qaeda, of Islamic State, of numerous smaller jihadist organizations as well, the leadership is relatively well credentialed. And Pew surveys have found, actually, that the more educated you are in the Islamic world, the more likely you are to be involved with a terrorist organization. Not necessarily the suicide bomber himself, that usually tends to come from a poorer background, but you're involved in more of the organizational aspect of running these groups. And if you look at, for example, Hamas or Hezbollah, these two organizations are not strictly terrorist outfits. They have that, but they also have welfare divisions that give charity. They maintain schools, they run hospitals. So they are an all-purpose, effectively mini government. And terrorism is simply one of the things they do. And so they do actually use educated people in the administration of their organization. There's a comment here. We've now seen Ataturk's secular state almost completely dismantled by Islamists under Erdogan. I would say that some of that is true. There are a lot of secular elements of Turkey that have not been dismantled, though, by Erdogan. Probably the biggest one is the Diyanet. The Diyanet is the Turkish religious ministry, and the Diyanet is responsible for coordinating all the speeches in all the mosques in Turkey. In Turkey, there is no religious independence for the various imams in the various mosques giving their own unique dissertations or sermons on Friday day for prayer. So the Diyanet is the ministry that controls that. They control ordination and certification. There are a number of different issues over which the Diyanet has primary control. So that's one way, for example, that Ataturk secularized the state that hasn't really come undone. What Erdogan has done is primarily cosmetic changes that result in negative outcomes, let's say. I think the clearest one is when he argued that he couldn't deflate the currency by raising the interest rate, because that would be an act of usury, and usury is, or riba, is against Islamic law. There's nothing in Turkey that would forbid it, but he said he couldn't do it, and so Turkish inflation went through the roof. But these are not fundamental changes to the construct of Turkey. The bigger issue that I have with Erdogan is actually his ability to acquire power to himself and increasingly limit the power of other branches of the government, which ironically is very similar to the way Kemal ruled, and is very different from the way the country was governed in the 50s and 60s, which is the Turkey that actually I think would be the better form of Turkey to revert to, not necessarily that Kemal built. I also think that we ignore the ethnic segregation and the imprisonment for thought crimes that occurred under Ataturk at our peril when trying to argue that he was the best thing for Turkey. There's a comment here nicely presented. However, this presentation unfortunately fails to account for the long-standing role of Western imperial powers played in fostering anti-modern regimes, destroy the Ottoman Empire, and assert control over the region's resources. Saudi was a creature of the West since its founding. I would agree that the Saudis had deep and intimate relations with the West, but not since their founding. Saudi Arabia was founded and then reached out to the West in order to secure its borders after the regime already came into existence. And then the West only began to support the Saudis in earnest in the 1940s. In fact, we discussed during the formation of Saudi Arabia that the West decided to back the state of Hijaz under the Sharif of Mecca, who was the arch rival of the Saudis. So there's some degree to which the West supported and countenanced him, and there's some degree to which the West simply accepted a fait accompli there. And since Ibn Saud knew to play nice with the West, he was able to survive. But I think that's a very different thing than to say that the West was fostering it. I also would argue that the West's actions primarily delegitimized whatever movement they touched more than supported whatever movement they touched. And so Mossadegh, after Operation Ajax, for example, in 1953, was more valid to most Iranians and is still recalled by most Iranians favorably. It's very similar in that degree with Abdul Karim Qasim, because of the thought that the United States may have been behind his assassination, and also in 1963. So I'm not quite sure that that's direct. I addressed the secularist argument. I addressed the Kurds. Somebody was asking what the name of the book read by Sadegh Hidayat was. That was both the Ikur, the Blind Owl. There's a comment that Pan-Arabism and Pan-Africanism should be a fun debate. Absolutely. I think one of the funnier points there is that Gaddafi in Libya was a Arab socialist, and so he connected with the Arab world, but he also tried to be the leader of Africa. And so that those dual roles ended up pulling at different strands of his own person. So I think that's very much on point. There's a question of, was the assassination attempt on Nasser based on his nationalization of the Suez Canal? This is the assassination by the Muslim Brotherhood. And their assassination of him was not because of the nationalization of the Suez Canal. They were in favor of that. The Muslim Brotherhood was trying to assassinate him because he was anti-religious, and he was also deeply opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood itself. He had used them to come into power in 1952 with the Free Officers' coup. But after that point, he didn't take their opinion and views seriously. So he began to marginalize them, and when they pushed back, he began to repress the organization. And so the organization tried to assassinate him in order to secure their own longevity. What it ended up doing was putting Sayyid Qutb in jail, who we're going to talk about next week in a lot of detail, because he's one of the leaders of the Islamist movement. And it gave him the moment to write down all of his major books, which are now part and parcel of that movement. Excellent layout of the various kind of political leanings in these states, but it seems as U.S. moves away, most states other than Iran have adopted real politics between each other and made long-term business and political deals with Israel. The Palestine thing will always be there, but we do see a Singapore-like future for the Middle East aside from Iran, Iraq, and Syria, where countries maintain hard political control with liberal economic policies and a high living standard and achieve stability. I would agree that Arab socialism has failed, and we were gonna talk about that, but time didn't permit, so we'll talk about that next week. I would agree also that border nationalism is generally not used, not rejected, just not used. With the exception of Egypt and Tunisia. And Tunisia, it's basically the same as ethno-nationalism, because Tunisia is literally 99.9% Arab Amazigh mix. In the other issue is that as Islamism became more powerful, the countries that resisted it basically resorted to military-style governments that don't try to legitimate themselves. Things like the Egypt Caudillo-style governments, the various militias controlling Libya. And so, yes, I would agree that it's more of a real politic than trying to demonstrate an ideological right to rule. They simply use the power of the state. But as we saw from Arab Spring, that's not a terribly compelling reason for a lot of the population. And so if Arab rulers want to have a accepting population, they're going to need to find a source of legitimation. All right, I think that covers all of the questions. Does anybody want to ask something out loud, or should we just close this out? All right, I guess in one of the points also there is that the Palestine thing will generally be ignored. I agree that for states like the Emirates, Palestine is an annoyance. And so that's why they did the Abraham Accords. Iran is a much bigger threat to them. But I don't think that that will be the case for a number of other states in the Middle East, especially those that are more outside of the US sphere. So I don't see it necessarily going away as easily as some people think it will. But all right, so since that is everything, and we're already beginning to see people, I'm going to close this out. Thank you everybody for coming, and I hope this was enjoyable. That part on Arab socialism and the reign of Nasser we're going to talk about next week on Wednesday. Remember, we're shifting to Wednesdays. And after that, we will talk about Islamism and the history and development of that.